Well, welcome back to Ultrasound Essentials. I hope you've all had the opportunity to have a nice lunch. It's my pleasure to introduce our co-chair for the next session. I'd like to introduce Osama Naji. Osama is a consultant gynecologist at Guy's and St Thomas's, one of the, I guess you could say, the top teaching hospital in London. Osama is very much an expert in gynecological imaging, running the rapid access cancer service at Thomas's, and of course also a lot of experience in early pregnancy, and I think probably made a name in ultrasound looking at cesarean section scars before people thought it was a topical subject. So I'm delighted to have Osama here with us, and I'm going to hand over to him as my co-chair this afternoon. Thanks, Osama.
Good afternoon, Tom, and to the audience. Many thanks for this opportunity. I'm delighted to be with you on this platform today. I have to start by saying a very big thanks to Tom, to ISWOG for their commitment and substantial effort behind running this very large scale spreading knowledge and science of women's ultrasound. I learned that the audience or registration are in access or pretty much short of 10,000, which is a remarkable achievement. I would like to introduce my boss, my mentor, Tom. I could go on and maybe hijack the whole session to talk about him, or maybe I could just summarize it with two little words. He's a senior clinician and very esteemed professor and chair of various committees and organizations, and he dedicated a lot of his time towards teaching in particular, which we all admire, with his style, with his fatherhood commitment towards his fellows, and for the all working with him. So I have had the privilege to work very closely with him, and I will hopefully continue to do so. And Professor Bowen will talk to us about a very important aspect, how to minimize or avoid diagnostic errors in early pregnancy. And I'm very much looking forward to hear it from him.
Okay, so this talk is going to cover quite a lot of ground in early pregnancy, and it's a absolutely straight up appeal that the most important thing when looking after women in early pregnancy is that do no harm, because in many cases doing nothing is not going to be a problem, and intervening, especially when we have powerful drugs like methotrexate to use, or perhaps we take a patient to surgery because we think there's a miscarriage. If we get it wrong, the consequences are disastrous. And I'm going to touch on a few things other people are speaking about later, but I'm going to talk about them quite peripherally. So let's just talk about just not making mistakes, really. Because otherwise, certainly in the UK, this is the kind of headline you get in the newspapers. And whilst obviously mistakes can be made, I think the one thing that someone or a woman expects us to get right is whether their baby, for example, is alive or dead. And unfortunately, sometimes we really don't get that right at all. And so it's really, really important message. Depending on which country you work in, I think women are now coming to be looked at more and more, early in their pregnancy. And you can see from Cecilia Bottomley's data here that, with these super positive pregnancy tests, very often people come, at 5 weeks even, and you can see that the chance of having a diagnostic scan is pretty low, actually. Only perhaps 20-25% at that stage, and a lot of these patients are going to have, we're not going to see a pregnancy, or if we see a gestation sac, we're not going to know if it's viable. And once we get into that situation, there is the opportunity for error. So that's at 5 weeks. At 6 weeks, it's a bit better, but even at 7 weeks, we're going to have an uncertain outcome from that scan in somewhere between 20 and 35%. Once we're in that situation, we have decisions to make. Do you come back or bring the patient back for another scan? If you can't see a pregnancy at all, do you measure serum HCG? How do you manage that person? Do the same rules apply if you have a transabdominal scanner as opposed to a transvaginal scanner? That's something that we're going to touch on later on. I think Chris Kyriakou in his case studies, and I think Alex Novak will talk a little bit about how handheld ultrasound, using abdominal handheld ultrasound, clearly the criteria for diagnosing miscarriage, for example, is going to be slightly different. Let's first of all, do you have to scan people? So, one error is basically rationing scans. So here we have again Cecilia Bottomley's data. We can see that, if a patient is asymptomatic and you ration people's scans and say, I'm not going to scan you until 7 weeks, that's probably okay because they've got no symptoms and they haven't come to any harm. However, if you have patients with pain or bleeding and you ration the scans, you can see that if you say, well, I'm not going to scan you because you're less than 7 weeks, for example, you will miss a number of ectopic pregnancies. So you do about 20 or 30 scans, and every time you do 20 or 30 scans in this group, you're going to find one ectopic. That's important. And I should add that these are not, these are clinically significant ectopics, some of whom required surgical intervention. So they're not entirely benign. So in symptomatic women, you basically have to scan them if you can. If they're asymptomatic, you can say, look, come at 7 weeks, because if you're coming before that, we're going to have a higher chance of having an inconclusive scan. But of course, in some places, you're not going to scan them at all because you don't have the facility or the resources to do so. And in asymptomatic women, there's no problem with that. Symptomatic women, you need to try and find a way of providing a scanning service. Ectopic pregnancy, just to say, it's based on visualizing an ectopic pregnancy mass. This is Emma Kirk's data, but in this she quoted George Kondis, who is looking at patients who having a vaginal scan, and you can see that immediately prior to intervention, you should be able to pick up an ectopic, I'll just go backwards, an ectopic pregnancy at least 99% of the time with a high level of specificity. This is sensitivity and this is the specificity. You'll see that what happened with Emma, sorry, I beg your pardon, but you can see what happened with Emma Kirk in her study. This is at first presentation, and at first presentation, sensitivity drops down to 74%. So in some cases, you're going to find that you can't see an ectopic initially, and they are pregnancies of unknown location. You mustn't make a presumptive diagnosis of ectopic pregnancy based on the presence of a pseudo-sac. This is something that's been talked about quite a lot in the literature, looking at fluid in the cavity. And even in this case, you can see here, this is an image from Carol Benson's, one of her papers. People have called this fluid in the cavity a pseudo-sac and even used this as a marker of probable ectopic pregnancy. It isn't. If we look at Carol Benson's paper, this is a retrospective analysis, she found that there was a vanishingly small chance in her retrospective study that fluid in the cavity, pseudo-sac, whatever you call it, is associated with an ectopic. It's far more likely to be an intrauterine. So, we still see examples of people being given methotrexate or having interventions because of presumed ectopics because of this finding. It's not. It's more likely to be an intrauterine. If you want to diagnose an ectopic, you should be visualizing them on scan. Here we have data from Margot Pikowski, who's a PhD candidate at Imperial, prospectively studying intercavity fluid in pregnancies of unknown location, 800, almost 800 pregnancies. And it's just, clear prospectively, consecutive women, that if you have intercavity fluid present, most of them are going to be intrauterine pregnancies, and very few are going to be ectopic pregnancies. So in terms of avoiding diagnostic error, this is not a useful sign. It is still in some guidance, even in the UK with NICE. It says that a collection of fluid within the uterine cavity, sometimes described as a pseudo-sac, is a possible sign of ectopic pregnancy. This is wrong. You need to ignore it. And this is Peter Dubilay's paper where he looked at some false positive diagnoses. And these are patients, all of whom were diagnosed with ectopics, partly on the basis of having a so-called pseudo-sac. I mean, this one, you can see there's a yolk sac. All of these patients received methotrexate, other than this one, who was booked for surgical management of miscarriage until she had a repeat scan. Sadly, all of these had embryopathy secondary to methotrexate. And this one, of course, we would have terminated an entirely normal pregnancy. So, sorry to emphasize the point, but diagnostic error, make sure that you don't adhere to this old approach to diagnosing ectopics and talking about pseudo-sacs as a risk factor. If we're going to talk about managing ectopic pregnancies, again, we're making a diagnostic error. Really important that if you think about giving methotrexate for an ectopic pregnancy, somebody senior reviews the scan. It's not just given on the basis of someone junior. So the most senior person should review the scan and check that there is indeed, as you can see here, an ectopic mass present. And in my view, I would not give methotrexate unless we had actually repeated the HCG 48 hours later and looked at the HCG ratio before giving methotrexate. And I'd want that change in HCG to be incompatible really with a viable intrauterine pregnancy. So you have to take great care if you're giving methotrexate. Don't give it at the first visit. Now, if you look in the RCOG guidance in the UK, methotrexate should never be given at the first visit unless the diagnosis is absolutely clear. And also remember that expectant management is also an option if you have the right setup. In other words, the patient is compliant and the patient can contact you in the event and they know exactly what to do in the event they get pain or there's a problem. So that might not be possible. If you're working in an environment where it's difficult to get the patients to come to see you at all, then clearly these types of treatment may not be appropriate and surgery is probably going to be the best approach. And that's something we have to adhere to in London as well as anywhere else. If you can't see a pregnancy in the uterus, then we now certainly, I'm not sure if it's possible all over the world, but we use HCG levels to decide how to manage the patient. A PUL is when on a scan we can't see evidence of a pregnancy inside or outside the uterus, and basically management's based on saying someone's at low risk of ectopic or high risk of ectopic, depending on the HCG ratio, or we can use a mathematical model. So it's not actually about knowing the pregnancy location, it's about saying this is low risk, and if it's low risk, then you may choose to, for example, bring them back in a week's time, or even, if it's low risk and you think it's failing, you might do a pregnancy test in a week. If it's high risk, the patient would come back in 48 hours, you'd repeat the scan in the HCG. I think it's important to say that this is not the only company, this is Abbott, but handheld point of care devices are now available where you can measure HCG, and I guess this might change the capacity to do HCG testing in some environments. But the problem is people don't know how to follow people up, and blood tests and so on can be quite chaotic. So there has to be a way of rationalizing this. If you look at pregnancies of unknown location, this is data which Ben Van Calster published, just to say, in purple are ectopics, yellow here are intrauterine pregnancies, viable intrauterines, and blue is failing. You can see a few things that most, if you say that the HCG over 2,500, which some people say can be a sign of ectopic pregnancy, well, not really, because you're going to have just as many intrauterine pregnancies which are viable in that area, and also failing intrauterines. Similarly, people say, well, you're not going to have an ectopic pregnancy if the HCG is less than 1,000. That's also not true, because if you're any good at scanning, you're going to find most of these ectopics are going to have HCGs of less than 1,000. So single measurements of HCG are not helpful, really, in making a diagnosis of ectopic pregnancy. If you look at rises or drops in HCG, you find similar problems. About a 50% rise, you can see you have a number of ectopics here, but you've also got a number of viable intrauterine pregnancies who have got an HCG rise of less than 50%, and even some have got a drop as well. So some of these things you've got to be very, very careful on. I think the best way, of actually looking at HCGs is to use a mathematical model. This is actually the M4 model. It defines a space here, and that's the best way of discriminating between intrauterine pregnancies and ectopic pregnancies in the PUL population. So if you have a patient who where you can't actually see the pregnancy on your vaginal scan, ideally you'd use progesterone and HCG. Now, clearly progesterone, it may not be possible to measure where you work, but if the progesterone is less than 2, then you simply do a pregnancy test in 2 weeks, and that will almost certainly be a failing pregnancy. For the rest, you would look at your HCG at time 0, and then you'd repeat it at 48 hours, and then you'd use the M6 model, which is a mathematical model, which takes into account all of these things. You don't have to have progesterone if you're not able to measure it, and you enter the model and it'll tell you whether it's high risk or low risk, and that will determine the management, whether you repeat the scan and HCG in 48 hours, or whether you say do a scan in a week if you think it's viable, or urinary pregnancy test in 2 weeks if it's failed. And you can get this model at that website. That, in terms of test performance, using that two-step protocol, will classify 62% of PULs as low risk with a very high negative predictive value for ectopic pregnancy, almost 99%, and will detect 92% of ectopic pregnancies. So that's the best way of doing this. But the point is, be very aware that single measurements of HCG are unhelpful. Cut-off values or discriminatory zones are unhelpful. And whatever way you do it, you need to look at the change in HCG over time as an indicator of how you're going to triage these patients. If you can use progesterone, then it's helpful at very low levels. But if you're just using HCG, look at the change over time and stop using discriminatory zones and thresholds. They're out of date and you shouldn't use them. And again, Chris Kriyaku will probably show you some cases to demonstrate that later. And then you can just come up and predict the outcome. This is actually looking at entering some data. It's point of care very quickly in 12 minutes. You put the data in, it gives you a risk. Okay, moving on quickly. What about non-tubal ectopic pregnancies? I think there's an issue here because we really don't have very good diagnostic criteria for any of the non-tubal ectopics. If you again look at the RCOG guidance in the UK, we talk about the interstitial line, which we're going to talk about later, I think, and having a mantle of myometrium around the ectopic. I mean, you can see that here if you like. I think that might be an interstitial line, but certainly you can see myometrium in this interstitial ectopic. And we talk about using three-dimensional ultrasound if it's available. Many of you will not have 3D ultrasound. And that may not be a bad thing, because if you look at the evidence grade for these diagnostic criteria, it's not based on the best evidence, and we don't really have proper trials looking at it. And I think this is problematic, because you can see here on a 3D ultrasound, this is what we would say is an interstitial ectopic, but this isn't. You know, when you do this scan in 2D, looks a little bit strange, doesn't it, in terms of the location. When you do a 3D scan, you can see this is up, it's in the endometrial cavity, but it's angular. This pregnancy will simply develop into the cavity and does not need intervention. But you can see how you can make a mistake here. And I'm sure that in some cases, pregnancies like this get terminated or get treated with methotrexate when it's unnecessary, which of course is a tragedy. So I'm saying take great care, because it will do this. Similarly, this is a slightly larger image of a similar type of case where it will have started up here in the angle and is growing into the cavity and will turn out as a perfectly okay intrauterine pregnancy. And so we have to be careful with non-tubal ectopics. If we have interstitial pregnancies, that's fine. But what if it's here in the angle? You can see how there is the potential for diagnostic error. And you can see how there's the potential for diagnostic error with a low implanted pregnancy as opposed to a cervical pregnancy. And when we talk about cesarean scars, the whole debate at the moment is prognosis if the pregnancy is near the scar, over the scar, partially into the scar, or breaching the serosal line. And you can see that the outcome, depending on where this pregnancy is likely to be different, and the counselling for the patient would be different. That was something which wasn't really considered previously, but we now have sensible guidance. If we look at this, the diagnostic criteria here are not particularly clear, because it suggests that any of these, can be present. But the question is, how many need to be present for this to be diagnostic, and what is the diagnostic performance of any or all of these criteria? And to my knowledge, I don't think we really know. So, we say the following is a list of diagnostic criteria used to diagnose scar pregnancy, but obviously we need to subject these to some sort of proper trial to see, how good we are at detecting them. But perhaps certainly as important, how many times do we say there's a scar pregnancy when there actually isn't one there? And of course, all of this is in the hand of experts. What is happening out there with people who are not experts? However, if you look moving forward, you can see this is data which is driven by Judith Hearn, who's going to speak later on. And I think this is quite sensible. Got to be aware that you can have a low implanted pregnancy, which is nowhere near a scar. It's important. And that's very different to these types where you have nominally, you can see here, this is the cavity, the cavity line. And you can see if the largest part is the sac crosses the uterine cavity line, going to have a different, as you can see it here on an ultrasound image. You can see where the largest part of the sac does not cross the intracavity line here, as you can see here. Or you can have situations where the scar pregnancy actually crosses the line which marks the serosal surface of the uterus, protruding out here. Now, it is likely that the prognosis of these different pregnancies is very different, and we've got to be quite careful. But certainly, discriminating between this and this should be possible. But very clearly, you can see how pregnancy sacs on or towards this niche, there is the potential for diagnostic error. So I would say that if you think that you have a cesarean scar pregnancy, it depends on the expertise you have where you work. But before doing anything, be very careful to have it checked by the most senior person. And if possible, if there is a center of excellence or a place where has most experience of dealing with these, refer the patient and don't try and diagnose it or deal with it yourself, in order to avoid diagnostic error and also problems in terms of how best to treat it. Because if it's relatively early gestation, then such an ultrasound guide, and I emphasize ultrasound guided curettage is I think safe and appropriate in my view, and I think people like Davo Jurkovic, who in my view is definitely the international expert on this, would say the same. Once we get into later gestations and where the pregnancy just goes through the serosal line, it becomes much more difficult to treat these, and it's absolutely necessary to have these managed at a center of excellence, if at all possible, because these can be very difficult to deal with. Miscarriage. I'm just going to show you this data very, very quickly because it illustrates why it's important to have good diagnostic test data. This is a paper from Jessica Preiser, who was working with the Imperial at the time. This is an extension of a paper by Yazan Abdallah, who is chairing one of the sessions today. He did a great study showing that the diagnostic criteria was simply wrong in 2011. Now, if you look here, even in Jessica Preiser's data, you can see using the old cutoff, which were used in the USA, where a mean sac diameter of 16 millimeters, if it was an empty sac to find a miscarriage, you can see that there's a false positive rate of 3.3. 1 in 30 pregnancies, you'll say there's a miscarriage, you'll get it wrong. 20 millimeters is what we used in the UK. 1 in 200, you'll get it wrong. Neither of these numbers is acceptable. And that's why we now say it has to be an empty sac of at least 25, as you can see here. Similarly, with crown rump length, 5 millimeters we used in the States, 1 in 28 times, you would get it wrong. And 6 millimeters in the UK, you get it wrong about 1% of the time. Again, unacceptable, and that's why we now use 7. But even so, if you find that a patient has an empty sac of 25 millimeters, or you have an embryo with no heartbeat, have a low threshold for repeating a scan at an interval. It's not a problem. You have to have certainty, but you must have appropriate training in order if you're going to scan an early pregnancy. And if you diagnose miscarriage, have it checked by a second experienced operator. This is a critical decision in a couple's life. When do you repeat scans? Well, the RCOG and NICE say always repeat in a week. All I will say is it depends. I would suggest that it's better to repeat in 14 days. And absolutely, if you only have a transabdominal ultrasound machine where you work, or if you're using point of care ultrasound, then you need to change your criteria and be much more conservative and bring everyone back in 14 days. I know that's a problem because some people will bleed, people will be anxious, but it's the only way to avoid diagnostic error. And you can see how we certainly showed that if the gestation sac was empty in less than 12, then you need to return at least 14 days later before you can take a view on there being a definitive diagnosis of miscarriage. So I'm going to finish there and just say, what really important, it doesn't matter the gestation. I sometimes think people think that somehow ultrasound in early pregnancy is, low priority, but it deserves the same level of competence from people examining them, same robust diagnostic criteria and the same care and compassion. We know that early pregnancy loss is associated with high levels of post-traumatic stress and psychological illness. We don't know how we can change that, but I'm sure that showing compassion and empathy and being careful over the language we use. We don't talk about abortion as people still talk about. We talk about miscarriage. We don't talk about evacuation of retained product. We talk about surgical management of miscarriage. Everything you do for the women in this situation matters because they remember every single thing. And diagnostic error, the National Academy of Science in the States said addressing diagnostic error is a moral, ethical, and public health imperative. Absolutely. So getting the diagnosis right is imperative. And, Stuart Campbell wrote a review on diagnostic error in early pregnancy, and he said the death of an early pregnancy should be regarded as of equal significance as that occurring at a later stage. He's absolutely right. Because for women and their partners, the trauma of pregnancy loss is the same, irrespective of gestation. There is no, hierarchy of loss. And therefore, we absolutely have to make sure we don't make any errors here. And others will talk more about all of these topics in more detail. I just think it's important that we all understand how important this diagnosis is. So I'm going to finish there. And thank you. And again, we can talk about some of these issues, but I think we're going to touch on them with cases and with some of the talks later on. Probably I'm just going to move on and try and answer some of the questions in the chat and deal with some of the questions later on. So thank you, and see you back as chair.
Excellent. Tom, this is hugely helpful, insightful, and very applicable as well. Thank you very much for sharing this summary for a very important and relevant topic. If I may start the questions, I think a couple of questions are lining up as well. Now, Tom, how do you advise us on managing patients? Because there is a fine line between managing clinically and the psychological morbidity behind, particularly if there is a history of previous early pregnancy loss. I'm sure you are all familiar with the concept of reassurance scan. So quite often patients come quite early and within the gray area between 4 and 6 weeks, where we all know the ultrasound is limited to give them valuable information, and demanding reassurance scan, especially when they are prepared to pay for it. So despite of telling them that the pregnancy in the all advanced systems experience hands, experience eyes, we may not be able to see anything, and they are still willing to have a scan, and they will end up in this territory of tracking it by blood results every 48 hours to ensure which line. So this again could contribute to their anxiety. Is there a reasonable way to tell them, in the absence of symptoms, sit tight, give us 2 weeks, 3 weeks, if you would like to see something on the scan, probably come back at a later date? Or how would you like us to manage it?
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally, I don't think it is helpful to have super early scans. I mean, if if you know, unless they've got symptoms, if someone has symptoms, I think that does change things, because obviously dates aren't always entirely reliable. And we know from Cecilia's data that there will be some ectopics in that group, and those ectopics are not insignificant ones. I mean, people would be tempted to say that they don't matter because they'll fail or something. That isn't the experience we have from that. So I do think sometimes it's reasonable for clinicians to say that I think it's a bit early, and if you want to have a scan for reassurance, you should come, at a sensible time, because it's not going to be very helpful for the reasons you say. It creates the opportunity for iatrogenic error, because you're going to scan someone, and then you're forcing clinicians into making decisions, interpreting HCG values, interpreting scans. And I think it's better not to create that situation. I think you'd be better off saying, look, you've got no symptoms, there's no reason to believe there's an issue. Obviously, if you have a problem, come back, but I'd like to scan you at 7 weeks, and that would seem like a sensible time, and hopefully we can reassure you everything's okay. Clearly, there's a slightly different situation where people have had a previous ectopic pregnancy, where they're advised to come back for an early scan, and they're very anxious. But again, unless they have symptoms, if you're not careful, you're going to lock them into the PUL story again as well. And a lot of healthcare settings anyway don't do early scans. I understand what you're saying in private practice, and some countries they do reassurance scans. But obviously in the UK, for example, we do ask people to come back if they had a previous ectopic pregnancy. And the other group of patients who've had recurrent miscarriage. But we don't help them hugely by adding to their anxiety, by saying, oh dear, I can't see anything, which is anxiety provoking in itself, and then making them have blood tests every 48 hours. So I think that's unhelpful from a psychological point of view, and also creates the opportunity to have someone to make an error, for a situation which is entirely natural. You're sort of medicalizing a normal pregnancy quite often in that situation. So I don't think that's helpful. And I think we can be straight and just say, I'm very sorry, but I think we should scan you later. A few of those patients, no doubt, if they're in private practice, will walk off down the road and get a scan anyway. But at the end of the day, I think you have to do what's right for the patient.
Absolutely. Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes,
That's the way it goes.
Yes, indeed. Well, I'm glad I have been on. I'm proud to be trained on this ethos of practicing. So I guess we are probably running a little bit, maybe near the time or short of time. There are a couple of interesting questions, but it looks like I may ask you, Tom, please, to reply to them digitally.
Well, there's a couple on sections, guys, but I think we can raise that with hopefully Judith, who I see is there with us. So I think they're kind of related, and we can probably touch on those later. I would think would be sensible. So maybe we do that.
Yes.